The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling grasslands of eastern Colorado, where the Great Plains stretched endlessly toward the horizon like a vast green ocean frozen in time. Marcus Thompson adjusted his worn Stetson against the glare as he surveyed his struggling cattle ranch from the porch of his weathered farmhouse. The wooden structure had stood for over a century, its gray boards bearing the scars of countless storms, scorching summers, and bitter winters that had tested the resolve of every generation that called this place home. The ranch encompassed nearly 3,000 acres of mixed grassland and creek bottom, stretching from the rolling hills in the north to the flat prairie that extended south toward the Kansas border. It had been in Sarah's family for 4 generations, passed down from her great-grandfather, who had claimed the land during the Homestead Act of 1862. Each generation had added their own improvements: barns, fences, irrigation systems, and the deep well that still provided water for the house and cattle. At 52, Marcus carried the weight of 3 years of drought, mounting debts, and the crushing loneliness that had settled over him like dust after his wife Sarah's death. The ranch that had once been their shared dream now felt like a prison of memories. Every corner of the property held echoes of her laughter. Every sunset reminded him of the evenings they'd spent planning their future together, and every dawn brought the fresh pain of waking up to an empty house. Sarah had been the heart of their operation, managing the books, coordinating with veterinarians, and maintaining the delicate relationships with suppliers and buyers that kept a ranch profitable. More than that, she had been the dreamer, the one who saw possibilities where Marcus saw only problems. She had talked constantly about sustainable practices, about working with the land rather than against it, about creating a legacy that would last for generations. The wind whispered through the tall prairie grass, a sound that had once brought him comfort but now only emphasized the emptiness surrounding him. His nearest neighbor, old Pete Morrison, lived 15 miles away across the rolling hills, and his only regular human contact came from weekly trips to the small town of Cedar Ridge for supplies. The locals were kind enough, offering their condolences and asking about the ranch, but their conversations felt hollow, like echoes in an empty canyon. Cedar Ridge had been a thriving agricultural community once, with a population of nearly 2,000 people. Now it was down to fewer than 600, its main street dotted with empty storefronts, and its school consolidated with 3 other districts. The drought had hit everyone hard, forcing many families to sell their land to corporate farming operations or simply abandon their properties to the bank. Marcus's financial situation was precarious at best. The drought had decimated his cattle herd, forcing him to sell off most of his stock at prices that barely covered the feed costs. His prize bull, a magnificent Angus named Thunder that had sired half the calves on the ranch, had died during the worst of the heat wave the previous summer. The remaining 40 head of cattle were a mix of older cows and young steers, not enough to generate significant income but too valuable to simply liquidate. The bank had been patient, but patience had limits, and Marcus could feel those limits approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. His savings were nearly depleted, and the insurance money from Sarah's death had gone toward medical bills that had accumulated during her final months battling cancer. The ranch was mortgaged to the hilt, and the monthly payments consumed nearly everything he earned from his remaining cattle and the small hay operation. He ran on the irrigated fields near the creek. Marcus walked to the edge of his property, where a creek meandered through a grove of cottonwoods. The trees provided the only shade for miles, their leaves rustling in the persistent prairie wind that never seemed to cease. It was here, in this peaceful spot, that he often came to think about Sarah and wonder if he had the strength to keep the ranch running alone. The creek had been Sarah's favorite place on the property. She'd spent hours here reading, sketching wildflowers, and talking about her dreams of turning the ranch into a sustainable operation that worked with nature rather than against it. The creek bottom was rich with wildlife that had somehow survived the drought better than the cattle. Deer came to drink in the early morning and evening, their tracks crisscrossing the muddy banks. Hawks circled overhead, hunting for prairie dogs and rabbits. Occasionally, Marcus would spot a family of foxes, or catch a glimpse of a coyote slinking through the tall grass. Sarah had kept detailed journals of the wildlife she observed, documenting seasonal patterns and population changes with the dedication of a trained naturalist. As he approached the creek, he heard something unexpected, a soft melodic voice, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. The words flowed like water over stones, rhythmic and musical in a way that seemed to harmonize with the natural sounds around them. Hidden behind the cottonwoods, he glimpsed a young woman sitting by the water's edge. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with long black hair braided with small feathers and beads that caught the morning light. Her clothing was a mix of traditional and modern worn jeans, paired with a beautifully beaded vest over a simple cotton shirt. What struck Marcus most was that she seemed to be having a conversation with the wind itself. Her hands moved gracefully as she spoke, fingers dancing through the air as if she were conducting an invisible orchestra. She paused regularly, tilting her head as if listening to responses only she could hear. Her voice rose and fell with the natural rhythm of the breeze, creating an almost musical dialogue with the elements around her. The young woman's ritual appeared to follow a specific pattern. She would speak for several minutes, then fall silent, listening intently to something that Marcus couldn't perceive. Sometimes she would nod, as if receiving confirmation of something important. Other times she would shake her head and speak again, as if seeking clarification or asking additional questions. Her entire being seemed focused on this invisible conversation, her body language indicating the kind of intense concentration that Marcus associated with important negotiations or crucial decisions. Marcus stood transfixed, not wanting to intrude on what seemed like a sacred moment. He had lived on this land for over 20 years, but he had never witnessed anything like this. The young woman's presence brought a sense of peace to the landscape that he hadn't felt since Sarah's passing. There was something about her stillness, her complete connection to the moment, that made him acutely aware of how disconnected he had become from his own surroundings. The woman's conversation with the wind continued for nearly an hour. Marcus found himself reluctant to leave, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a deep, almost desperate need to understand what she was experiencing. Here was someone who seemed to have found a way to communicate with the very forces that surrounded them, to find meaning and connection in the emptiness that had become his world. As the sun climbed higher, the young woman finally stood, brushing dust from her jeans and gathering a small leather pouch that had been beside her on the ground. She turned toward the ranch house, and for a moment, Marcus thought she might have seen him, but instead of approaching, she walked along the creek in the opposite direction, disappearing into the tall grass as silently as she had appeared. That evening, Marcus found himself unable to concentrate on his usual routine. He sat on the porch, long after dark, listening to the wind and wondering what the young woman had heard in its voice. The encounter had stirred something in him that had been dormant since Sarah's death, a sense of curiosity about the world beyond his immediate struggles, a hunger for understanding that went deeper than the practical concerns of ranch management. If you're finding this story as captivating as Marcus found this mysterious encounter, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens when these two worlds collide. The journey we're about to take will change everything you think you know about connection and healing. An unexpected connection for 3 days. Marcus found himself returning to the creek at the same time each morning, hoping to encounter the mysterious woman again. His daily routine, which had become mechanical and joyless since Sarah's death, now had a focal point that gave him something to anticipate. He told himself it was simple curiosity, but deep down he knew it was something more, a desperate hope that this stranger might somehow provide a key to understanding what was missing from his life. The morning routine that had once been shared with Sarah now felt like a hollow echo of better times. He would wake before dawn, make coffee in the same pot they'd used for 20 years, and step onto the porch to watch the sunrise, paint the prairie in shades of gold and pink. Sarah had always been the first to spot the deer coming to drink at the creek, the first to notice changes in the weather, the first to celebrate the small miracles of ranch life that made their isolated existence feel rich and meaningful. On the 4th day, she was there again, sitting in the same spot by the water's edge. This time, Marcus didn't hide. He approached slowly, making enough noise to announce his presence without startling her. She looked up as he drew near, and he was struck by her eyes, dark and deep, with a kind of ancient wisdom that seemed incongruous with her youthful appearance. "I'm sorry for trespassing on your land," she said, her English clear but accented with the soft rhythms of her native language. "My grandmother told me about this place. She said the spirits of the water and wind gather here to share their wisdom." Marcus found himself oddly comforted by her presence, rather than annoyed by the trespass. "You're welcome to visit any time," he heard himself saying. "This place has been too quiet for too long." The young woman introduced herself as Nayeli Blackhorse, a member of the Southern Ute tribe. She explained that she lived on the Southern Ute Reservation, about an hour's drive away, where she worked as a cultural liaison, helping to preserve traditional knowledge and practices. She had a degree in environmental science from Colorado State University, but had chosen to dedicate her life to bridging the gap between her people's ancient wisdom and modern conservation efforts. I come here because the wind speaks differently in this place, Nayeli explained, settling back down by the creek. My grandmother, she was a medicine woman, and she taught me to listen when I was very young. She said that those who learn to hear the wind's voice never truly walk alone. Nayeli's grandmother had been Maria Horse, a respected elder who had served as a cultural keeper for the Southern Ute people until her death 5 years earlier. Maria had grown up in the traditional way, learning the stories, songs, and ceremonies that connected her people to the land. She had also been a practical woman, working as a nurse on the reservation and raising 7 children, while maintaining her role as a spiritual leader. My grandmother used to say that the wind carries the voices of our ancestors, Nayeli continued. Every prayer, every song, every story that has ever been spoken aloud becomes part of the wind's memory. She taught me to listen for those voices. When I was just a child, Marcus sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. What do you mean by the wind speaks? I hear it all the time, but it's just ... wind. Nayeli smiled, a gentle expression that transformed her serious face. That's what most people think. But the wind carries messages. It brings news from distant places, carries the prayers of those who have gone before us, and connects all living things in ways that your science is only beginning to understand. She explained that her work at the reservation involved documenting traditional ecological knowledge for use in modern conservation efforts. Her tribe had been managing the land sustainably for centuries before European settlers arrived, and their practices were proving valuable in addressing contemporary environmental challenges. We're working with the National Park Service and the Forest Service to reintroduce traditional fire management practices, Nayeli said. What you call controlled burns, we have been doing for generations. The land needs fire to stay healthy, to clear out the undergrowth and make room for new growth. The conversation flowed easily between them, and Marcus found himself sharing details about his ranch and his struggles that he hadn't discussed with anyone since Sarah's death. Nayeli listened with the kind of focused attention that had become rare in his experience. She asked thoughtful questions about his cattle operation, his water rights, and his plans for the future. Your wife understood this place, Nayeli observed, as they watched the sunrise paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. The wind remembers her. It speaks of how she would sit here and listen to the stories it carried. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. How could you possibly know that? Because the wind remembers everything, Nayeli replied simply. Every breath, every word, every prayer that has ever been spoken in this place. Your wife's spirit is woven into this land. Now, that's why you feel her presence so strongly here. Over the following weeks, Marcus began timing his daily walks to coincide with Nayeli's visits. He learned that she made the drive from the reservation 3 times a week, always arriving at dawn and staying until the sun climbed high enough to burn off the morning dew. Her visits weren't random. She followed a schedule based on traditional knowledge about when the wind carried the clearest messages. The loneliness that had been Marcus's constant companion for 3 years began to lift in Nayeli's presence. She brought not just human companionship, but a different way of seeing the world around him. Through her eyes, his ranch wasn't just struggling land and dying cattle. It was a living ecosystem with its own rhythm and wisdom. Nayeli began sharing stories about her grandmother's teachings, explaining how traditional knowledge had been passed down through generations of careful observation and spiritual practice. She spoke of the interconnectedness of all living things, of the responsibility that came with living on the land, and of the importance of maintaining balance between human needs and natural systems. My grandmother used to say that we don't own the land, Nayeli explained one morning, as they watched a family of deer drinking from the creek. We are caretakers, responsible for maintaining the health of the land for future generations. Every decision we make should consider the impact on the 7th generation yet to come. Marcus found these concepts challenging, but intriguing. His approach to ranch management had always been practical and immediate, focused on the next season's profits, the next year's production goals, the next decade's sustainability. The idea of thinking 7 generations into the future seemed both impossible and essential. As autumn approached, Marcus found himself looking forward to their conversations more than anything else in his routine. Nayeli had a way of explaining traditional concepts in terms that made sense to his rational, Western-educated mind. She spoke of the wind as a communication network, connecting all living things in a web of information. Exchange that modern science was only beginning to understand through studies of plant communication and ecosystem interconnectedness. My people, have always known what your scientists are discovering now, she explained one day. That everything in nature is connected. That information flows between plants, animals, and even the air itself. What you call talking to the wind is really just learning to tap into that network. The practical implications of this worldview began to influence Marcus's daily decisions. He started paying closer attention to the behavior of his cattle, noticing patterns in their movement and grazing habits that he had previously overlooked. He observed the wildlife around the creek more carefully, recognizing signs of environmental stress or health that correlated with conditions affecting his livestock. Most importantly, he began to see his financial struggles not as isolated problems, but as symptoms of a larger disconnection from the natural systems that sustained his ranch. The drought wasn't just a weather pattern. It was a message about the need to adapt his practices to work with natural cycles rather than against them. "Learning to listen, will you teach me?" Marcus asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. The question had been building in him for weeks. Born from a deep hunger to understand what Nayeli experienced during her conversations with the wind. "I've lived on this land for decades, but I feel like I've never really known it." Nayeli studied his face carefully, as if looking for something specific. "The wind doesn't speak to everyone the same way," she warned. "And it requires patience. Most people in your culture have forgotten how to be still, how to listen with more than just their ears." "I have time," Marcus replied. And for the first time in months, he meant it. The ranch work that had once consumed his days had been reduced to the bare minimum needed to keep his remaining cattle alive. The rest of his time stretched before him like an empty canvas, waiting to be filled with something meaningful. The lessons began simply. Nayeli taught Marcus to sit quietly by the creek for extended periods, learning to distinguish between the different sounds the wind made as it moved through various landscapes. The whisper through prairie grass carried a different quality than the rustle through cottonwood leaves or the whistle across bare rock. Each sound had its own character, its own message. "Start by focusing on your breath," Nayeli instructed during their first formal lesson. "Feel the air entering and leaving your lungs. Remember that this same air has been breathed by every living thing on this land. You are participating in a conversation that has been going on for millions of years." Marcus found the concept both humbling and overwhelming. The idea that he was breathing the same air that had sustained the buffalo herds, the Native American tribes, the early settlers, and countless generations of plants and animals gave him a sense of connection to something much larger than his individual concerns. "Your grief has made you deaf to everything but your own pain," Nayeli observed gently during one of their sessions. "The wind has been trying to comfort you, but you haven't been listening. You've been so focused on what you've lost that you can't hear what's still here." Marcus found the practice challenging at first. His mind constantly wandered to ranch business, financial worries, and memories of Sarah. Every time he tried to focus on the wind, his thoughts pulled him back to the mundane concerns that had dominated his life since her death. The silence that Nayeli seemed to slip into so easily felt foreign and uncomfortable to him. "Don't try to empty your mind," Nayeli advised when he expressed his frustration. "That's a misunderstanding many people have about meditation. Instead, let your thoughts come and go, like clouds in the sky. Acknowledge them, but don't hold on to them. The wind will speak when you're ready to hear it." The process was gradual and often frustrating. Marcus would sit by the creek for hours, listening to the wind and hearing only the same sounds he had always heard. Nayeli remained patient, sharing stories about her own learning process and the years it had taken her to develop her sensitivity to the wind's messages. "My grandmother started teaching me when I was 7 years old," she explained. "But I didn't really understand what she was talking about until I was in my teens." It takes time to develop the ability to listen at that level. Your mind has to learn to be quiet enough to hear the subtle messages. Gradually, under Nayeli's patient guidance, Marcus began to achieve moments of genuine stillness. In those quiet spaces, he started to understand what she meant about listening with more than just his ears. The wind wasn't just moving air, it was carrying information, scents, and sounds from distant places, creating a complex tapestry of sensory data that his urban-trained mind had learned to ignore. The breakthrough came on a particularly windy day in late autumn. A strong front was moving through, bringing with it the first hints of winter. As they sat by the creek, Marcus suddenly felt something shift in his awareness. The wind wasn't just noise anymore, it was language, communication. A vast network of information flowing across the landscape. "I can hear it," he whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "It's like ... like everything is connected." Like Sarah is still here somehow, still part of everything. Nayeli nodded knowingly. Now you're beginning to understand. The wind remembers everyone who has ever breathed it. Your wife's spirit lives in every breeze that touches the land she loved. She's not gone, she's become part of the larger conversation. The experience was transformative, but also overwhelming. Marcus found himself flooded with sensory information that he had never noticed before. The subtle changes in air pressure that signaled weather changes, the scents that indicated the health of distant grasslands, the sounds that revealed the presence of wildlife miles away. It's too much, he said, struggling to process the flood of information. How do you make sense of it all? Practice, Nayeli replied simply. And trust. You don't have to understand everything at once. Just as you learned to read words by starting with letters, you'll learn to read the wind by starting with simple messages. As winter deepened, Marcus found himself changed in ways he couldn't fully explain. The crushing loneliness that had defined his existence since Sarah's death had transformed into something else. A sense of connection to the land that went beyond mere ownership. He began to understand his ranch as Sarah had always seen it, not as property to be exploited, but as a living entity to be respected and nurtured. The financial pressures hadn't disappeared, but somehow they felt more manageable now. Marcus had learned to listen not just to the wind but to the land itself, understanding when his remaining cattle were stressed, when the grass needed rest, when the creek was running low. His decision-making process had become more intuitive, guided by a deeper awareness of the natural rhythms that governed his environment. The wind has been your teacher all along, Nayeli observed during one of their winter sessions. You just needed someone to help you remember how to listen. The practical benefits of his new awareness became apparent as the winter progressed. Marcus began to anticipate weather changes days in advance, moving his cattle to sheltered areas before storms arrived. He could sense when the animals were becoming sick before symptoms appeared, allowing him to provide treatment before problems became serious. Most importantly, he began to understand the subtle signs that indicated the overall health of his land. The wind carries information about everything that lives on this land, Nayeli explained. The plants, the animals, the water, the soil, they all have their own voices, their own messages. When you learn to listen, you can hear what they need, what they're struggling with, what they're celebrating. Marcus's relationship with his cattle began to change as well. Instead of seeing them as economic units to be managed, he started to understand them as individuals with their own personalities, needs, and preferences. He learned to read their body language, to understand their social hierarchies, to recognize signs of contentment or distress that he had previously missed. The transformation in his livestock management had tangible results. His cattle were healthier, requiring fewer interventions and producing better quality meat. The calves born that spring were stronger and more vigorous than any he had seen in years. Most importantly, his costs were decreasing as he relied less on expensive inputs and more on his understanding of natural systems. The healing windspring arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of gentle rains that Colorado ranchers prayed for. Marcus stood in his fields, watching the grass grow green and thick for the first time in years. The transformation was remarkable, not just in the landscape, but in his entire approach to managing the ranch. The financial pressures hadn't disappeared, but somehow they felt more manageable now. He had learned to work with the natural rhythms of the land rather than against them. The changes in Marcus's ranch had not gone unnoticed in the surrounding community. Old Pete Morrison, his nearest neighbor, had driven over one morning to see what Marcus was doing differently. Pete had been ranching in the area for over 40 years, and he had never seen grass recover so quickly from drought conditions. "What's your secret, Marcus?" Pete asked as they walked through the pasture where Marcus's cattle were grazing. "Last year this field was nothing but bare dirt and weeds. Now it looks like something out of a farming magazine." Marcus found himself struggling to explain his new approach without sounding like he had lost his mind. How could he tell Pete that he had learned to listen to the wind, that he made grazing decisions based on conversations with a young Native American woman who claimed to hear the voices of her ancestors? "I'm working with someone who understands traditional land management," he said finally. "We're using grazing patterns that work with natural cycles instead of against them." Word of Marcus's transformation had begun to spread through the local agricultural community. Other ranchers, struggling with their own challenges of drought, debt, and despair, began stopping by to see what he was doing differently. They found him working with a young Native American woman who seemed to understand the land in ways that defied conventional agricultural wisdom. Nayeli had become not just his teacher, but his closest friend, an unofficial partner in developing a new approach to ranch management. Their afternoon sessions by the creek had evolved into a deeper collaboration that combined traditional ecological knowledge with modern sustainable practices. She helped him implement grazing patterns that her people had used for centuries, while he shared his knowledge of contemporary ranch operations, veterinary care, and market dynamics. "The wind told me you were ready for this," Nayeli said one day as they watched Marcus's cattle grazing peacefully in a meadow that had been barren the previous year. "It said you needed to learn how to be alone without being lonely." Marcus understood what she meant. The silence that had once oppressed him now felt full of possibility. He could hear the conversations happening all around him, the wind speaking to the grass answering the earth responding to the sky. He was no longer isolated, but part of an ongoing dialogue that had been happening long before he arrived, and would continue long after he was gone. The practical results of his new approach were undeniable. His remaining cattle were healthier, requiring fewer antibiotics and supplements. The grass was more resilient, recovering quickly from grazing and drought. The creek ran clearer, and wildlife had returned to areas that had been barren for years. Most importantly, the ranch was becoming financially viable again, not through expansion or intensification, but through careful attention to the natural systems that sustained it. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, an agricultural extension agent from Colorado State University, visited the ranch in late spring to document what she called an unprecedented recovery. She was particularly interested in the traditional grazing practices that Nayeli had introduced, which seemed to restore grassland health in ways that conventional methods had failed to achieve. "What you're doing here challenges everything we thought we knew about ranch management in semi-arid environments," Dr. Hernandez told Marcus during her visit. "The combination of traditional ecological knowledge and modern monitoring techniques is producing results that we need to study and potentially replicate across the region." Dr. Hernandez was part of a growing movement within the agricultural research community that was beginning to recognize the value of traditional knowledge systems. Her research focused on what she called indigenous science, the sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships that had been developed by Native American communities over thousands of years. "We're finally starting to understand that traditional knowledge isn't just folklore," she explained to Marcus and Nayeli. "It's based on centuries of careful observation and experimentation. The practices your people developed are often more effective than modern techniques because they're based on a deeper understanding of natural systems." Nayeli established a small educational program that brought together ranchers, environmental scientists, and tribal elders to share knowledge about sustainable land management. The program met monthly at Marcus's ranch, using his property as a living laboratory for testing and demonstrating integrated approaches to agriculture and conservation. The first workshop attracted 12 participants, a mix of struggling ranchers, university researchers, and members of various tribes with traditional knowledge about grassland management. Marcus found himself in the unusual position of being both student and teacher, sharing his experience of learning to listen to the land, while also providing practical insights about the challenges of ranch operations. "This isn't just about new techniques," Marcus explained to the group during one of the workshops. "It's about changing your relationship with the land. When you start listening to what the environment is telling you, you make better decisions. You work with natural systems, instead of fighting against them." The workshop participants included Tom Bradley, a third-generation rancher whose family had been struggling to maintain their operation in the face of increasing drought and debt; Sarah Martinez, a young veterinarian who was interested in holistic approaches to animal health; Dr. James Running Bear, a tribal elder and retired professor who had spent decades documenting traditional ecological knowledge; and Linda Chen, a journalist who was writing a book about sustainable agriculture in the American West. Each participant brought their own perspective and expertise to the discussions. Tom shared his frustrations with conventional approaches that seemed to be failing in the face of climate change. Sarah discussed the connections between animal health and environmental health. Dr. Running Bear told stories about how his ancestors had managed the same landscapes for thousands of years. Linda documented the conversations and connections that were forming between people from very different backgrounds. The program grew rapidly, attracting attention from across the region. Within 6 months, they were hosting workshops for groups of 30 or more participants. The topics expanded to include water management, soil health, wildlife conservation, and the economics of sustainable agriculture. Marcus found himself traveling to other ranches and reservations to share his story and learn from others who were pursuing similar approaches. "We're not just saving one ranch," Nayeli observed during one of their evening conversations. "We're helping to preserve and share knowledge that could change how people relate to the land across the entire region." The success of the program had attracted attention from beyond the local agricultural community. A documentary filmmaker from Denver had contacted Marcus about featuring his story in a film about sustainable agriculture and traditional knowledge. Agricultural journals were requesting articles about his methods. The Natural Resources Conservation Service had asked him to serve on a committee developing new guidelines for drought-resistant grazing practices. Most importantly, young people, both native and non-native, were coming to learn from the program that he and Nayeli had developed. Marcus found himself mentoring teenagers and young adults who were interested in careers that combined traditional knowledge with modern science. Some were from ranching families looking for alternatives to conventional practices. Others were Native American students seeking to connect with their cultural heritage while pursuing scientific careers. One evening, as Marcus and Nayeli sat by the creek watching the stars emerge in the clear prairie sky, he reflected on how much had changed since that first day he'd seen her talking to the wind. The ranch was prospering in ways he hadn't thought possible. More importantly, he had found a sense of purpose and connection that he thought had died with Sarah. "I thought I'd lost everything when Sarah died," he said quietly. "But maybe I just needed to learn a different way of listening." Nayeli smiled, her face peaceful in the starlight. "The wind has been waiting for you to hear it your whole life. It just took the right circumstances to help you understand the language it speaks." As if summoned by her words, a gentle breeze stirred the cottonwoods, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of tomorrow. Marcus closed his eyes and listened, hearing in that soft whisper not just the voice of the wind but the eternal conversation between all living things, a dialogue of which he was now, finally, a part. The transformation of Marcus's ranch had attracted attention from beyond the local agricultural community. A documentary filmmaker from Denver had contacted him about featuring his story in a film about sustainable agriculture and traditional knowledge. Agricultural journals were requesting articles about his methods. Most importantly, young people, both native and non-native, were coming to learn from the program that he and Nayeli had developed. "We're not just saving one ranch," Nayeli observed during one of their evening conversations. "We're helping to preserve and share knowledge that could change how people relate to the land across the entire region." Marcus nodded, understanding that his personal journey from grief to healing had become part of something much larger. The lonely rancher who had thought his story was ending had instead found himself at the beginning of a new chapter, one that honored both his wife's memory and the ancient wisdom of the land itself. The program continued to grow, attracting participants from across the western United States and even international visitors interested in learning about the integration of traditional and modern knowledge systems. Marcus and Nayeli were invited to speak at conferences, contribute to research projects, and serve on advisory committees for various government agencies and nonprofit organizations. But despite the recognition and success, Marcus remained most grateful for the simple gift that had started it all, the ability to hear the wind's voice and to understand his place in the larger conversation between all living things. Every morning, he still walked to the creek to listen, and every evening, he felt Sarah's presence in the gentle breeze that carried the scent of prairie grass and the promise of tomorrow. The wind continued to speak to those who knew how to listen, carrying stories of loss and renewal, of connection and healing, of the eternal dance between human aspirations and natural wisdom. And in that ongoing conversation, Marcus had found his place, not as a conqueror of the land, but as a participant in its ancient story, a student of its teachings, and a guardian of its future. This story of connection and healing shows us that sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. If Marcus's journey touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more inspiring stories about finding hope in the most unlikely places. Share this story with someone who might need to hear that they're never truly alone. The wind is always listening, and it's always ready to teach those who are ready to learn. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that could change your perspective on life itself. And remember, the most profound transformations often begin with the simplest act of listening to the world around us.